I'm Ben.
I'm Mason.
Welcome back to Stadium Stats.
Week 2, baby.
This week gave us a little bit more insight as to what teams are going to be actually good this season and what teams aren't.
It was a pretty exciting week, not gonna lie. Like, there weren't any major upsets, but there were some really great games.
A lot of the games were pretty close.
Yeah.
So let's get right into it. We'll start off with the Vikings-Eagles game, our Thursday night football game, and final score.
Interesting call at the end.
Yeah, final score 28-34. Eagles win. Vikings are now 0-2. Eagles 2-0. The Vikings fumbled how many times this game? It felt like I think they fumbled. I think they fumbled. They lost four fumbles. That they fumbled 3 times in the first half, and then Justin Jefferson fumbled to lose them the game at the end. Justin Jefferson of all players.
Isn't this their second one-score loss of the season already?
Yeah, after not having a single one-score loss all of last year.
I mean, it just goes to show that, like, what everyone was saying about the Vikings last year, about, they're pretenders, you can't sustain this many one-score wins. Like,
they were right.
It's coming to fruition already very early on in the season. So
but it's funny because the year before, that's how they were just like this, where they lost all their one-score games. They're going back and forth. But looking at the stats of this one, Kirk Cousins, 31 of 44, 360 yards and 4 touchdowns. He played really well. The loss was not on him. Alexander Mattison played pretty poorly at running back, 8 for 28. He also had a fumble.
I mean, they are seeming to miss Dalvin Cook already. I don't.
Yeah.
The cutting or release, was he released? Was he cut?
He was same thing.
Yeah.
He was released.
Yeah. I mean, they're very clearly missing him. Their run game is just not anything right now, and they're solely what it feels like relying on Justin Jefferson and Jordan Adams and TJ
Hawkinson had 2 touchdowns in this game, and Justin Jefferson had 160 yards. Continues to have no touchdowns because Justin Jefferson just doesn't score very much for some reason.
It's very similar to like Julio Jones.
Yeah, it's a very similar vibe. Jordan Addison, 3 for 72 and a touchdown in his second game in his second career game, so he looked pretty good. And then Danielle Hunter, this Vikings defense had so many sacks. They let up a lot of points. 34 is a lot. But Danielle Hunter had 3 sacks. They had a collective, I believe, 5 sacks against the Eagles' O-line. So that was pretty impressive. Huge step up for their defense in that regard, but the rest of their defense was pretty bad. Mm-hmm. Jalen Hurts, he was fine, 18-23, 193 yards, a touchdown and an interception. The real highlight for this team was DeAndre Swift on the ground, was 28 for 175 and a touchdown.
I benched him in fantasy this week.
Well, he had 1 carry last week. It's not surprising.
I mean, I didn't play him last week either. He's just been sitting on my bench, but like in our league, he sat on my bench and he's now I'm not going to win the week.
But nobody was expecting him to have 28 carries after he had 1 last week.
No, of course, and it doesn't help that he just like he's always been a great back who's kind of just been sitting behind other great backs.
Yeah.
So it's been really cool to see him, especially in this week.
Yeah, and then receiving wise, Devontae Smith was really good, 4 for 131 and a touchdown. And outside of that, no one did too much of anything. Their defense really never got going. The Vikings scored a lot. They had a couple sacks. Jordan Davis and Josh Sweat each had a sack, and that's about it.
Jordan Davis is already shaping up to be an absolute force.
Yeah.
It's just like they drafted all of Georgia's front 7, it seems like, and when you're drafting from such a high caliber of defensive rookies, you're going to win games. Especially the Eagles look great. They probably are in closer games than they should be if they want to be Super Bowl contenders, but they're sneaking the wins out, and a win is a win. Yeah.
The next game was the Ravens-Bengals. Ravens won 27-24. Both teams looked much improved from last week.
Agreed.
The Ravens defense looked a little worse because they let up more points, but it was to a much better team than the Texans. So Lamar was 24 of 33, 237, and 2 touchdowns passing. Their running game really was a 3-headed monster of Gus Edwards, Lamar Jackson, and Justice Hill, who each had about 50 yards apiece.
Yeah, I mean, Lamar on 12 carries is very typical Lamar stuff.
But... Yeah, and then receiving-wise, Nelson Aguilar was actually their top receiver. OBJ, Odell Beckham Jr., he actually got hurt in this game, but their receiving work I mean, Lamar had a decent amount of passing yards, but no receiver really stood out. Nelson Aguilar and Zay Flowers had about 60 yards apiece, and Mark Andrews had 50.
I mean, this was truly an offensive team effort from the Ravens. The love was spread throughout. They look really good.
Yeah.
I mean, Lamar is putting the cards on the table and saying, "This is why you pay me."
Yeah. On defense, their new addition in the offseason, Jadeveon Clowney, had a sack, and that was about... And we got Geno Stone with an interception, and that was about it for defense. The Bengals, on the other hand, Joe Burrow, 27 and 41 for 220 yards, 2 touchdowns and an interception. A lot better than the 0 touchdowns and 80 yards of last week, but still not Joe Burrow. You paid him to be the most... You paid him the most of any quarterback or any player in the league. He should be doing better than this, but it's a decent improvement. Joe Mixon, 13 for 59 rushing, and they really did not rush very much outside of him. And then T. Higgins with quite a bounce-back game after having 10 or so targets last week and 0 receptions. This week he had 8 for 89 and 2 touchdowns. Jamar Chase, though, only had 30 yards on 5 catches. Tyler Boyd did better with 52 yards.
Yeah, I mean, the Bengals offense, it looks fine. It doesn't look like how the Bengals offense should look, though, and that's concerning. I'm really starting to have questions about what can this Bengals team really do. They're coming into the season as, AFC Championship contenders, playoff, locks, and even maybe Super Bowl contenders, and they're just not doing any of that to start the season, and I really do wonder, what is the problem right now?
What really stood out to me, though, about the Bengals, their defense looks not great. They had 0 sacks, 0 interceptions. Lamar is a very, he's prone to making mistakes in the passing game, and they did not take advantage of that at all. Special teams shout out, by the way, Charlie Jones with a return touchdown, 81 yards.
Always nice to see. I always love special teams touchdowns. There's just something so I guess special about them.
Special.
But no, yeah, it was a close game. Good AFC North matchup.
Our first upset of the week was the Seahawks beating the Lions 37-31. Seahawks coming back from rebounding quite well from their loss to the Rams. The Lions looked a lot worse than they did against the Chiefs.
They still didn't look bad.
No, the score was high, but both defenses are not very good.
Overtime win for Seattle.
Yeah, Geno Smith was 32-41, 330 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their running game really never got going. Kenneth Walker only had 2.5 yards a carry, but he did have 2 touchdowns. And then receiving-wise, DK Metcalf was really good, 6 for 75. Tyler Lockett, 8 for 59 and 2 touchdowns. And then Noah Fant had 4 for 46.
Yeah, I mean, they just, they were able to squeak out a win. Their offense has a lot of weapons on it who, no one would have really suspected this a couple years ago. But they're looking pretty good. I like what the Seahawks are able to do.
Yeah, on defense, despite letting up 31 points, Trey Brown and Draymond Jones both had a sack, and Trey Brown also had an interception. For the Lions, Jared Goff was 28 of 35, 323 yards, 3 touchdowns, and his first interception since halfway through last season. He was on pace. He now is the third all-time in most amount of passes without an interception. But he broke his streak about 20 short of Aaron Rodgers' all-time record. Rushing-wise, Jahmyr Gibbs didn't look that good, 7 for 17. David Montgomery still being the lead back, 16 for 67 and a touchdown. And Amon-Ra St. Brown still being amazing in the receiving game, 6 for 102. Josh Reynolds and Sam Laporta also looked pretty good with 5 for 60 each. And Josh Reynolds actually had 2 touchdowns as well.
There's nothing really to be that concerned about the Lions right now. They still have all the pieces to have a good season, possibly win the NFC North. I think that they'll be fine. This isn't anything to really blink at.
The whole NFC North lost this week, so really just speaks to how open that division is. But the Lions are the clear-cut favorite still. I wouldn't overthink this week. The next game was the Colts-Texans. Colts won 31-20. Gardner Minshew came in relief of Anthony Richardson. Richardson had two rushing touchdowns, only 56 passing yards before he was removed from the game with a concussion. Gardner Minshew looked pretty good, though. 19 for 23, 170 yards and a touchdown. Their running game actually looked competent this week after last week. Anthony Richardson, as I said, had 2 rushing touchdowns. Zach Moss had 90 rushing yards and a touchdown. And then receiving-wise, it wasn't anything special, but Michael Pittman about 50 yards, and that was about it.
I mean, they played well, but at the same time, they were playing the dumpster fire that is the Houston Texans.
Yeah,
it's yes, you can get excited about it. Yes, Anthony Richardson looked great on the ground, and their running game was a lot better this week. Michael Pittman looks decent as usual, but at the same time, they're not playing anyone that special. They're playing a team, the glorified version of a placeholder of a team.
I will give them a lot of props, though, on the defensive side of the ball. 20 points is a lot more points that the Texans scored this week, but C.J. Stroud himself just looked better in general. But what the Colts did well, they had 6 sacks in this game, all from different players too. The Texans, C.J. Stroud again with a ton of passing attempts. This time 47 attempts, 30 completions, almost 400 yards and 2 touchdowns. Still no interceptions on 90-ish attempts. He has 0 interceptions, which for a rookie is really good.
He's looking good. They gave him the keys and said, drive the car. And he said, okay, and put his pedal to the floor and just, balled out. Unfortunately, in a loss, but, that's pretty common for
the Houston Texans.
For the Houston Texans and a rookie on a number 2 team.
Running-wise, they couldn't get going. Dameon Pierce was 15 for 31, and Devin Singletary 4 for 14. But receiving-wise, Nico Collins came out of nowhere. 7 receptions, 150 yards and a touchdown.
Again, on my fantasy bench.
Oh, Robert Woods looked good again, 6 for 74. And Tank Dell, the rookie, 7 for 72 and a touchdown. He looked really good.
I mean, it's the Texans. They're still in the rebuilding phase. They don't have a ton of pieces right now. But Stroud, today looked like he was progressing, looks pretty good as a rookie, so we'll see. We'll see where the Texans take it this season.
All right, let's move on to the Bears-Bucks.
Jesus.
Bears lost 17-27. This game actually did come down to the wire. The Bears got the ball back with about 2 minutes and had the chance to have a comeback drive. They were down 3, and then Justin Fields threw a pick 6. What I've come to realize about the Bears over these 2 weeks is Justin Fields really looks bad when the team has to rely on him to be the entire team. When it's the final moments of the game and he has to lead a comeback drive, he's not able to do it. The weapons around him aren't able to help him out enough in doing so, and that's where he looks his worst, and that's where he's having all of his turnovers.
It's now or never for Justin Fields. His time has come where it's time for him to do the same thing that other rookies have to do, that the rest of his class is having to do, is where, he has to show that he is the guy, and he's not showing that at all. He came into the season with so much preseason hype. People were saying the Bears, can win. The Bears can win the NFC North. The Bears can make the playoffs. Justin Fields is the guy. He's looking good. No, he isn't. He's so just not the guy. He has no reliable arm. He's great at rushing, but he's just not. He didn't have a good rushing performance today.
Today he was 4 for 3, and he did have a rushing touchdown, but yard wise he only had 3 rushing yards. 200 passing yards, that's the second game in a row with over 200, but that shouldn't be that impressive for a quarterback, and the fact that it's impressive for him is concerning.
And he threw 2 picks.
He threw 2 picks. He did have a passing touchdown. The rushing game just they didn't really rely on it much. It wasn't even that bad, though. They were averaging, Khalil Herbert averaged 5 yards a carry, and Roschon had 8 yards a carry, but they really just did not rely on the run at all. Receiving-wise, DJ Moore looked a lot better. He had more than 2 targets. He had 6 receptions for 100 yards. Chase Claypool had a touchdown, and Cole Kmet continued being pretty good in the receiving game. But that defense is such a liability. It's really problematic and concerning that Baker Mayfield threw for 300 yards on this defense.
I mean, I hate Baker as a player, but he did play really well today. And it's just, it's really nice to see, just Baker, I've never liked Baker. He's an OU player. but he played well.
He's fun to root for, but he's not that good. And the Bears made him actually look competent, which is just goes to show how poor the Bears did on defense. Rachaad White had 73 rushing yards and a touchdown, and Mike Evans had 171 receiving yards on 6 catches and a touchdown. Chris Godwin had 5 for 60. I mean, their whole team, their receiving game looked really good. Vita Vea on defense had a sack and a half, and Joe Tryon Shoyinka had 2 sacks. I mean, and Shaq Barrett and Cam Gill both had a sack each. Their defense looked really good, and their offense also looked really good, but that more so shows how bad the Bears' defense was.
Yeah, I mean, the Bucs are 2-0, but they've, been playing just kind of nothing.
Just NFC North teams.
Yeah.
The Bears and the Vikings. Yeah. Moving on to the next game. Mason had to go, but I'm going to cover the rest of this. Moving into the next game, we got the Chiefs versus the Jaguars. The final score was 17-9. The Chiefs won. Looking at the stats, Patrick Mahomes, 29 of 41 for 300 yards, 2 touchdowns and 1 interception. Isaiah Pacheco had quite the bounce-back game, 12 for 70. Nobody else too good on receiving. And the big surprise for receiving was Sky Moore, 3 for 70 and a touchdown. He came in really big right at the end of the game to guarantee the game for them. Justin Watson, their undrafted rookie from last year, looked pretty good, 3 for 62, and no one else really did much on offense. Defensively, they had George Karlaftis, their rookie from last year, with a sack and a half, and Chris Jones, first game back, instantly has a sack and a half, makes a huge difference. And then the Jaguars, Trevor Lawrence was 22 of 41 for 200 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions. Christian Kirk surprisingly had a pass for -1 yards. It was completed. But the Jags never got it going. They scored 0 touchdowns the whole game. Their passing game only 200 yards and no touchdowns. The running game was a combined 70 yards and, again, no touchdowns. And their only receiving weapons this week were Christian Kirk with a huge bounce-back game. After having only 1 catch, he goes up to 11 catches for 110 yards. And then Evan Engram, 6 for 57, was also pretty good. Calvin Ridley had a couple catches, and that was about it. Their defense was, mediocre. Their defense held the Chiefs to 17 points, so it was pretty good. But again, the Chiefs did not have Travis Kelce again, so it's hard to say whether the Jaguars really shut them down or not, because they let a few really newer receivers get a lot of yards on them. Moving on to the next game, though, we got the Packers-Falcons, and this one came down to the wire. There were a lot of games this weekend that came down to the wire. This game was a final score 24-25 in favor of the Falcons. Jordan Love was 14 for 25, 150 yards, and again he had 3 touchdowns and no interceptions. He might actually be leading the league in touchdowns now. I believe he has 6 after 2 weeks. The running game, they were missing Aaron Jones. So A.J. Dillon was the lead back. He had 15 for 55. Receiving wise, they were missing Christian Watson again, just like they were last week. The receiving game never really got going. Again, they only had 150 passing yards, but they did have 3 passing touchdowns. Dontavian Wicks with 1, and Jaden Reed had 2. On defense, Rasul Douglas had an interception, and nothing else too much of note. The Falcons, Desmond Ridder had a bounce-back game, passing-wise, because they actually threw for more than 100 yards. He went 19 for 32, 240 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. I think that was actually his first career interception in the NFL. And then rushing-wise, Bijan Robinson had an amazing game, 19 for 124. He's already taking over as the lead back. Tyler Algier was 16 for 48, not so good. And Desmond Ridder actually ran a bunch, 10 for 39 and a touchdown. It's crazy how many rushing attempts they have per game. They actually had 45 in this. It's 45. Sorry, 45 rushing attempts in this game. Receiving wise, Drake London had a bounce-back game, 6 for 67 and a touchdown after having 0 catches the whole week last week. Mac Hollins was 3 for 60, and Bijan and Jonnu Smith both were 4 for 48. Looking at the Falcons, honestly, they look pretty decent. They're 2-0 at this point. Packers, as I said earlier, the whole NFC North lost this week, so doesn't affect them too bad. They're still leading the division tied with the Lions. Looking at the next game, we got the Raiders and the Bills. The Bills won 38-10, and this was the bounce-back game they were looking for. This really was. Jimmy Garoppolo for the Raiders, 16 of 24, 185 yards, 1 touchdown to 2 interceptions. Rushing-wise, Josh Jacobs, 9 for -2 yards. He was absolutely awful on the ground. They could not get the ground game going, with the exception of Trey Tucker having 1 rush for 34 yards. Then we got, receiving-wise, Devontae Adams was 6 for 84 and a touchdown. Josh Jacobs actually got going in the receiving game, 5 for 51, and nothing else too much got going in the receiving game. Defensively, they did have a few sacks, but no interceptions on a very turnover-prone Josh Allen, so nothing too much of note. Josh Allen actually looked amazing. 31 of 37, 274 yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. Their running game also looked great. James Cook, 17 for 123, and Damian Harris and Latavius Murray both had rushing touchdowns. And their receiving game, surprisingly, Gabe Davis actually led, not Stephon Diggs. Gabe Davis, 6 for 92 and a touchdown. Stephon Diggs also looked pretty good, though, 7 for 66. And Dalton Kincaid, their rookie tight end, 5 for 43, also looked pretty good. And then, as I said earlier, they have 2 interceptions on defense. Terrell Bernard and Matt Milano both had an interception. So the Bills had exactly the bounce-back game they were looking for. The Raiders, bit on the rough side. They did not look good. This was the biggest blowout of the week. Next was the closest game of the week. It went into overtime. The Chargers versus the Titans, 24-27 in favor of the Titans. Justin Herbert, he played pretty well, 27 of 41, 300 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their running game, they were missing Austin Eckler, so it's really hard. It would have been really hard for them to be as efficient as they were last week, but they never got going. 13 for 39 for Joshua Kelly, no rushing touchdowns, and their next leading rusher had 10 yards. They had under 70 rushing yards as a team. But their receiving game, on the other hand, looked amazing. Keenan Allen, 8 for 111 and 2 touchdowns. Mike Williams, 8 for 83. They both played amazing. Defensively, Kenneth Murray Jr. and Tuli Tuipulotu both had a sack. Joey Bosa had 2 sacks. Morgan Fox had a sack. They made some work of the Titans O-line, but that's not saying much, seeing as the Titans O-line is not that good. Looking at the Titans, though, Ryan Tannehill, he played a lot better than he did last week. 20 of 24, pretty good completion percentage. 246 yards, 1 touchdown, no picks, unlike last week where he had 3. Rushing-wise, Derrick Henry was mediocre, 25 for 80, 1 touchdown. Tyjae Spears, their rookie, 8 for 49, 6 yards a carry. And what you really like to see for the Titans this week was Treylon Burks was their leading receiver with 3 for 76. He was mediocre at best as a first-round receiver last year, so it was nice to see him finally have a good game in just the second week of the year. Behind him was Chris Moore with 1 for 49 and DeAndre Hopkins for 4 for 40. Defensively, they just like the Chargers had a few guys with sacks. Harold Landry had a sack, Jeffrey Simmons had a sack, and Denico Autry had a sack. But all in all, the Titans have a bounce back, and the Chargers move to 0-2. Next was the Rams-Niners, and this game was a lot closer than I thought it would have been. I thought the 49ers were going to blow the Rams out of the water. I thought the Rams had just had an interesting showing, and they were a one-hit wonder after week 1. But no, they put up a good offense yet again. Their defense held the Niners for the first half at the very least. Brock Purdy didn't have a passing touchdown, only 200 yards. Christian McCaffrey looked really good. 20 for 116 and a touchdown. They also had Deebo Samuel, 5 for 38 rushing and a touchdown rushing. Brock Purdy also had a rushing touchdown, so they had 3 rushing touchdowns as a team to make up for the lack of receiving touchdowns. And receiving-wise, Deebo really just killed it this game. He also had 6 receptions for 63 yards in addition to his 38 rushing yards. Jawan Jennings had 1 really big catch, 2 for 51, and Ayuk got hurt pretty early on in the game. He did play the game through, but he didn't seem 100%, 3 for 43. And then defensively, they had 2 interceptions. Diamador Lenore and Isaiah Oliver both had interceptions. And let's get into the Rams. Matthew Stafford, 55 passing attempts, only 34 completions, 300 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. Rushing-wise, they actually benched Cam Akers going into the game and put him on the trade block, so they don't have any intention of moving on with him, which after last year, going through a very similar thing with Cam Akers, does not really surprise me. Kyren Williams started this game in his place, and he looked mediocre, 14 for 52 and a touchdown. What the biggest surprise was Puka Nacua. He broke out last week. He's a 5th-round rookie. No one expected much of him. And then in Cooper Kupp's absence, Puka Nacua becomes the number 1 receiver. And after having 119 yards last week on 10 receptions, he had 15 receptions this week for 147 yards. He has now set the all-time record for most receptions in the first 2 games of a receiver's career, with 25. The next closest, I believe, was 19 or 20. And then Tutu Atwell also looked pretty good, 7 for 77. But Puka Nacua just looked amazing, and it's just surprising with him being a 5th-round rookie how quickly he's broken into the league. But he just looks really good in Cooper Kupp's absence. But this game was a lot closer than I thought it would be. So props to the Rams, but the Niners did pull out the win. The weirdest game of the week, though, is the Giants-Cardinals. And the Cardinals do lose 28-31, which was expected. But it was the reason I say it was weird is because the first half, at the end of the first half, the Cardinals were winning 20-0 against the Giants, meaning the Giants had scored 0 points through the first game and a half of their season, seeing as they lost 40-0 last week to the Cowboys. But then it seemed as if the Cardinals remembered, oh yeah, we're tanking, and decided to start playing poorly, and they only scored 8 points in the second half compared to the Giants' 31. Daniel Jones had a monster second half. He finished the game 26 for 37, 300 yards, 2 touchdowns to 1 pick. Saquon Barkley did get injured towards the end of the game. He's seemingly going to miss the next few weeks, but he was 17 for 63 and a touchdown. Daniel Jones was 9 for 59 and a touchdown on the ground. And what they like to see receiving-wise was Jalen Hyatt, their rookie, had 2 for 89, and Darren Waller, their big offseason acquisition, was their second leading receiver at 6 for 76. So they both looked really good. Darius Slayton also had a few big catches, 3 for 62, and Isaiah Hodgins and Saquon Barkley both had receiving touchdowns. But defensively, both teams actually looked really bad. The Cardinals, as I said, didn't let up any points in the first half, but they let up 31 in the second half. And the Giants just had no major stats, no sacks, no interceptions. They let Josh Jacobs throw for 230 yards and a touchdown on them. They let James Conner have 100 rushing yards after not being that efficient as a runner last year or in week 1. They also let up 40 rushing yards and another rushing touchdown to Josh Dobbs on a crazy run where he broke a couple tackles and got into the end zone. Receiving-wise, Zach Ertz led the team. Zach Ertz and Michael Wilson led the team with 56 yards each, and Marquise Brown right behind them on 6 for 54 and a touchdown. And as I said, both defenses looked bad, but Jalen Thompson did have an interception, and they had Kaiser White and Dennis Gardeck both had a sack each. But overall, this game was honestly a tank bowl. it seemed like. It's still early on to say, but both teams looked really bad in their respective halves, and the Giants came up on top, I guess, because the Cardinals remembered that they did not want to win. But the biggest disaster game, well, I guess besides the Bills-Raiders, was the Jets-Cowboys, which was to no one's surprise. Zach Wilson was not supposed to be the starter this year, but he looked awful. 12 for 27, 170 yards, 1 touchdown to 3 interceptions. And to make matters worse, they could not get the run game going either, so their offense was non-existent. Breece Hall was 4 for 9 yards, Dalvin Cook 4 for 7, even worse, and Michael Carter 2 for 8. Zach Wilson did have 36 yards, but he was their leading rusher, and none of their running backs had double-digit rushing yards this week. Receiving-wise, though, Garrett Wilson had 1 monster catch. He finished the day 2 for 83 and a touchdown, and Tyler Conklin 5 for 50, and no one else did anything on defense. But the biggest surprise this week was the Jets' defense they looked pretty like manageable from an offensive perspective. They only had as a team 1 sack. They had no interceptions. Sauce dropped an interception. Sauce Gardner, after his amazing rookie year, he dropped an interception already. I'm sure they'll have a bounce-back game, but they did let up 30 points to the Cowboys. That being said, Dak Prescott had a bounce-back game. Not that he looked awful last week, but they just didn't need him to play because they won 40-0 against the Giants. This week he was 31 for 38, 250 yards and 2 touchdowns. Still yet to throw an interception after leading the league in interceptions, though, last year. So that's massive improvement. Running-wise, Tony Pollard, 25 for 72, less than 3 yards a carry and no touchdowns. Their rushing game was stopped pretty heavily. They just had a lot of attempts, so it looked like they had a lot of yards, but as a collective, their yards per carry was pretty poor. But where they shined was CeeDee Lamb was 11 for 143 in the receiving game. No one else really got going, but CeeDee Lamb kind of put the team on his back and brought them to a win. Defensively, as I said, they had 3 interceptions. Jaron Kearse, Malik Hooker, and Trayvon Diggs all had an interception. And Micah Parsons had 2 sacks. Osa Odighizuwa also had a sack. Their defense, it was against the Jets offense with Zach Wilson, but their defense did look pretty good. They only let up 10 points, but that's not saying much when Zach Wilson's the quarterback. One of the weirdest games this week, not quite as weird as the Giants-Cardinals, but the Commanders-Broncos game was really bizarre. Through the first half, the Broncos had scored 3 touchdowns, and going into the half, we're up 21-14, and then ended up blowing the lead in the second half. And on the last play, actually had a chance to come back and completed a Hail Mary to bring the score to 33-35. But they went for 2 and did not draw the flag, the pass interference flag they were hoping for, and the pass was not completed, and the 2-point conversion was no good. Sam Howell on the day, 27 for 39, 300 yards and 2 touchdowns. Brian Robinson looked really good on the ground, 18 for 87 with 2 touchdowns. They've really abandoned Antonio Gibson. He only had 2 carries this game after having around a similar amount last week. And Brian Robinson seems to really be their lead back, and he's really living up to it a lot more than he did last year. Going into his sophomore year, he just looks a lot better. Receiving-wise, nothing too special from anyone. It was a group effort. Terry McLaurin with about 50 yards and a touchdown. John Bates had around 50 yards. Antonio Gibson had almost 50 yards. Brian Robinson had almost 50 yards. They just had a bunch of receivers with mediocre stat lines. And where they really shined was in their sack count. Deron Payne had a sack. Montez Sweat had a sack and a half. Chase Young had a sack and a half. Nice bounce back game from him after being seemingly absent for the past year and a half since his injury. Jamin Davis had a sack. Casey Toohill had a sack. And James Smith-Williams also had a sack. for a collective 7 sacks as a team. 7 sacks as a team. And then the Broncos, they had Russell Wilson. He looked pretty decent. He went 18 for 32, 300 yards, 3 touchdowns to 1 interception. Also had 6 carries for 50 yards. Javonte Williams never really got going too well. He was 12 for 44. But what they really were happy to see this week was their rookie receiver, Marvin Mims, had a massive reception, finishing the day 2 for 113 and a touchdown. Cohen Sutton had 5 for 66. And Brandon Johnson had 2 for 66 with 2 touchdowns. But no one else really got going. Jerry Jeudy only 25 yards on his return. Defensively, they also had a decent amount of sacks. Nick Bonito had a sack. Randy Gregory had a sack. And Jonathan Cooper had 2. Again, very close game. But the Commanders sneak out the win, going to 2-0. And the Broncos are 0-2 with in the Sean Payton era. The exciting Sunday Night Football game this week was the Miami Dolphins versus the New England Patriots. The Miami Dolphins end up winning 24-17. Tua, 21 for 30, 250 yards with 1 touchdown and 1 interception. The big surprise was Raheem Mostert. They actually got their running game going this week. Raheem Mostert was 18 for 120 with 2 touchdowns. No one else really got many carries. It was clearly the Raheem Mostert show, which is surprising for a backfield with 4 backs that are relatively even on, that people expected would be relatively even on carries. But Savon Ahmed was the only other one. Devon Achane only had 1 carry. Savon Ahmed only had 3, and Jeff Wilson's hurt. Receiving wise, Jalen Waddle had a nice game, 4 for 86. Tyreek Hill was 5 for 40 and a touchdown, and no one. This passing game is all in the hands of the 2 of them. So you're never really expecting big games from anybody else. Maybe a couple catches from Braxton Berrios or Durham Smythe or the running backs, but you're typically going to rely on Waddle and Hill as to be that entire passing offense, and neither of them had over 100 yards, so they were bound to do worse than last week, but still a good showing. Defensively, they did have a couple sacks. Bradley Chubb had a sack, David Long had a sack, Christian Wilkins had a sack, and Andrew Van Ginkel had a sack. Andrew Van Ginkel, they had constant pressure with Andrew Van Ginkel the entire game. He just looked really good. Xavier Howard also had a nice interception off Mac Jones. Speaking of which, Mac Jones, 31 for 42, 230 yards with a touchdown and an interception. They're really relying on the pass a lot more than they did last year. Another game with 40 passing attempts. Rushing-wise, Ramondre Stevenson, 15 for 50 and a touchdown. And Mac Jones had a couple rushes, 5 for 25, and so did Zeke, but Zeke looked pretty bad, 5 for 13. Looking into the receiving game, though, Devontae Parker was the breakout receiver this week. They seem to always have a different receiver lead them in targets, receptions, yards, touchdowns. It's always someone different. This week it seemed to be Devontae Parker's turn to play well. Hunter Henry had another nice game, though, 6 for 52 and a touchdown. And so did Mike Gesicki, 5 for 33. They really like to use their tight ends in the Patriots offense. And what they like to see on defense is their rookie corner, Christian Gonzalez, had an interception off Tua. Also, Matthew Judon had a sack, but nothing else too special on defense. Which, for the Patriots, they did hold Waddle, and they did hold that Dolphins offense to only 250 passing yards, which is pretty impressive. However, no big numbers in the sack department and only 1 interception is actually surprisingly a little lackluster for the Patriots. Bill Belichick ran defense, but they still played pretty well. And then we actually had 2 Monday Night Football games this week. Starting off was the Saints-Panthers, where the Saints snuck out a win to go 2-0. They won 20-17. Panthers are now 0-2. Derek Carr only 21 for 36, 230 yards, no touchdowns, and 1 interception. Taysom Hill always gets a couple passes in there at quarterback. Rushing wise, their rushing leader was Taysom Hill. That weapon that no other team seems to have, where they can throw him in at quarterback for a couple plays and throw him in at running back for a couple plays and tight end for a couple plays. Maybe go out and catch some passes or block. He's just such a useful weapon for this team, and they really like to use him, and he's just so entertaining in that regard. But he was the only part of their rushing offense this week that could get going. He was 9 for 75 compared to Tony Jones Jr., who I don't think anybody was expecting to be their lead rusher. Went 12 for 34 and 2 touchdowns. Jamal Williams, their big offseason running back acquisition, the guy who had 1,000 rushing yards last year on the Detroit Lions, and also led the league in rushing touchdowns, breaking Barry Sanders' rushing record. He didn't even get the goal line work. He was 9 for 29, didn't get the touchdowns. He looked really, really sluggish. But luckily, the receiving game did get going. They didn't have any receiving touchdowns, but Chris Olave had 86 yards. Rashid Shaheed had 60 yards. Michael Thomas had 55 yards. Slantman seemed to be back, 7 for 55. And then defensively, they're always a pretty good team. Marcus May had a sack. Demario Davis had a sack. Carl Granderson had a sack. Nathan Shepard had a sack. They didn't force any interceptions from Bryce Young, which is a little disappointing, seeing as he threw 2 interceptions, both to Jesse Bates last week. But you can't always expect interceptions. Bryce Young went 22 of 33. He was held to 150 passing yards, but he did have a touchdown. Miles Sanders on the ground game never really got going, 14 for 43. Bryce Young did have a couple rushes for 34 yards, and Chuba Hubbard was 2 for 16. But their receiving game, they don't have that many good weapons in that receiving game. Adam Thielen, 7 for 54 and a touchdown, was their leading receiver. And their second receiver was their backup running back in Chuba Hubbard at 5 for 34. And no one else really got going. Their rookie receiver, Jonathan Mingo, did go 3 for 26. But that was about it. Defensively, Frankie Louvu broke out last year, had 2 sacks in this game. Von Bell did have an interception, their big safety acquisition from the Bengals in the offseason. Nothing else too crazy defensively from that game. Now, going into our other Monday Night Football game was the Browns-Steelers, and I'm just going to start off by saying, poor Nick Chubb. For those of you who saw the injury, it was a really brutal one. I'm wishing him the best. Had him in fantasy, unfortunately. Lost the week because of that, but he's also just, I think, a lot of people's one of their favorite players in the NFL. He's everyone's favorite running back, and it sucks to see him get hurt. Looked pretty serious, so hopefully he comes back soon. But the Browns blew the game 22-26 because Deshaun Watson, yet again, does not look to be the guy. Deshaun Watson went 22 of 40 for 230 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Never really... He just didn't look that good. He didn't pass the eye test too much. Jerome Ford, their backup running back, went 16 for 106 in Chubb's absence. Chubb did start the game off with 10 for 64, but again was carted off the field with a serious knee injury. He got hit in the knee by Minkah Fitzpatrick's helmet, and his knee bent completely backwards, so just wishing him the best. Receiving wise, Amari Cooper had 7 receptions for 90 yards. David Njoku, 4 receptions for 48 yards, and Elijah Moore came in big on a few plays with 3 for 36. And defensively, Grant Delpit did have an interception, and that was about it defensively. But speaking of defenses, let's talk Steelers. Kenny Pickett was not the reason they won this game. Kenny Pickett went 15 for 30, 200 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. You want to know what else was not how they won this game? Their running attack. Najee Harris, 10 for 43, Jaylen Warren, 6 for 20. That was it. Their receiving game, was all George Pickens. George Pickens went 4 for 127 yards and a touchdown. Jaylen Warren went 4 for 66, and no one else had more than 15 yards. So it really was all on their defense. Their defense in this game, Alex Highsmith had a pick six, and they also had a fumble recovery return for a touchdown late in the game to take the lead when they were down 19-22 in the fourth quarter. And the Browns just couldn't score after that. They were given plenty of opportunities and didn't score. TJ Watt came in big with that return, with the return on that sack, or on the fumble recovery. But the Steelers now 1-1. The Browns also 1-1 after their big win over the Bengals last week. Steelers' big loss over the Niners. I really thought this game would have gone the other way, but big surprise. But getting into this week's top 10 rankings, I'll start from 10 and go up to 1. But my top 10 power rankings this week, it does look a little bit different. At number 10, despite being 0-2, I still have faith in the Bengals. They had a nice bounce-back game. T. Higgins bounced back hard. He played well. But overall, their team looked like the Bengals of last year. They always tend to get beaten by the Ravens. Lamar has a very high winning record against the Bengals. So it wasn't really too much of a surprise, but it was a close game. At number 9, I got the Falcons. They're 2-0 now. They've beaten two mediocre teams in the Packers and the Panthers. However, their running game has just looked incredible, just like it did last year. And their receiving game looked improved this week. And their defense looks heavily improved from last year. It's no longer too much of a liability. And as they've covered up a few of their holes on that defense in the offseason. Number 8, I've got the Saints. I still do have them higher than the Falcons. Same division. I think the Saints do look a little bit better, but it's pretty close, all things considered, between the Saints and the Falcons. The Saints' defense still looks pretty good. Derek Carr didn't throw a touchdown this week, but they are 2-0. They've got a bunch of good receiving weapons in Chris Olave, Michael Thomas, and Rashid Shaheed. And all in all, their team is working together, and they're 2-0. Number 7, I've got the Bills. They had exactly the bounce back game they were looking for, 38-10 against the Raiders. Josh Allen had a monster game. Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis both look good. Dalton Kincaid, the rookie tight end, also looked good. Their running game looks much improved from last year with James Cook leading the way, had over 100 rushing yards. They looked like an all-around really good team. Their defense had multiple interceptions against Jimmy G and held the Raiders to only 10 points. It was exactly the win you wanted to see. Couldn't have asked for much more. I just can't put them any higher because they did lose to the Jets last week with Zach Wilson. At number 6, I've got the Ravens. They are 2-0, but they did play the Texans last week, and they played a really close game to the Bengals this week. But I do have to give them props. I do have them over the Bills because they beat a really good opponent in the Bengals this week. Their offense looks much improved. They've got receiving weapons in Zay Flowers and Odell Beckham Jr. and Rashad and they've also got the return of they've got the return of Rashad Bateman as well. But all in all, the Ravens look much improved from a receiving standpoint, and Lamar is still a really good rushing weapon. Does suck that they lost J.K. Dobbins, but their defense has stood strong. Holding the Texans to 9 last week, and a very explosive Bengals team to 24 this week. So all in all, the Ravens look pretty good. At number 5, I've got the Eagles. They are 2-0, but it has been 2 pretty close games, a lot closer than you would have thought they would have been. They did force a lot of fumbles against the Vikings this week, but the fact that it was 1 score, I just had to move them down a little bit. They look like the team of last year, but with Jalen Hurts being a little less explosive, a little more turnover prone, and all in all, their defense is letting up a lot more points than they were last year. So looks like a little bit of a downgrade, but still the same, but a very similar team to the team we saw in the Super Bowl last year. In at number 4, I've got the Dolphins. They are also 2-0. Played the Patriots a little tight, but they always play the Patriots tight. It's a Bill Belichick ran defense. They still scored 24 points against them. So they did show a little bit of mortality in the passing game with holding Tyreek to only 50 yards, and Jalen Waddle didn't have over 100 himself, but you can't expect 100-yard receivers every single week. And they made up for it in the running game this week with Mostert having over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. So they looked really good and a very much more balanced team this week. And their pass rush just looks really good. Both weeks it's looked really good. Defensively, they do let up a lot of points, but seeing as they let up over 30 last week to the Chargers, but their pass rush looks really good. Number 3, I've got the Chiefs. And I'm trying not to hold last week too much against them because they were without Travis Kelce, and they were without him again this week, which is why their offense has only put up 17 points each week, because they lack the depth. They don't have any good receivers. Their whole receiving core is Travis Kelce, and so without him, that offense is a lot less explosive. However, their defense appears to be back. Their defense let up 20 to the Lions last week, which isn't excessive by any means. However, they were without Chris Jones, and the Lions definitely used the run game to their advantage in that, as a result of that. But the Chiefs' defense was suffocating this week. They held the Jags to 9 points. Trevor Lawrence just couldn't get going. They scored 0 touchdowns, and the Chiefs' defense just looked really, really good. In at number 2, I've got the 49ers. They're also 2-0. Coming off another win against the division opponent Rams. This week was a lot closer. Last week was very decisive. They held the Steelers to 1 yard in the first half, or for most of the first half. Their offense looked explosive last week. This week they looked a little more human as a team. Brock Purdy didn't have any passing touchdowns, but their running game still looked really, really good. Their defense still looked pretty good. Came in clutch with 2 interceptions against Matthew Stafford, but they let up a lot of points this week for a team with only really young receivers in the Rams. Puka Nacua, 15 receptions, 150 yards, looked really good in his second NFL game as a 5th-round rookie. You can't have that. That pass defense needs some improvement in the 49ers, but the rest of the team looks really good. But my number 1 team this week, I've got the Cowboys. 2 very, very decisive wins. As little faith as I have in them in the playoffs, I just can't not put them at 1 right now. They have had 2 by far the most decisive wins. They've scored a combined 70 points in 2 weeks. They have held their opponents to a combined 10 points for a 60-point differential in 2 weeks. And that's just crazy. They look unstoppable right now. Their defense is just so good. Their offense doesn't look incredible, but it's very balanced. Tony Pollard played really well last week. Their passing game looked better than the run game this week. So they can operate on all sides of the ball. Even their special teams looked really good last week against the Giants with a blocked field goal returned for a touchdown. The Cowboys look really unstoppable right now, and I just can't wait for week 3 to see where these rankings go. But with that, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you guys next week. See ya.